Welcome to the Deep Dive. We know you're busy and want to learn fast. So we take a stack of books and articles, and we boil them down to the stuff you actually need, quickly and thoroughly, without all that overwhelming detail. And today, we're diving into Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. Specifically, books 1 and 2.
Yeah, we've got excerpts here on everything from like how pin factories work to the complexities of global trade to the government's role in all of it.
It sounded like a lot.
It is. But hopefully, we can extract some really relevant ideas about how wealth is created and distributed, stuff that might surprise you, maybe spark some aha moments.
All right, so let's start with, one of the most kind of revolutionary ideas for its time, the division of labor. And Smith wasn't just talking about assembly lines, he was really talking about this underlying principle of productivity that still shapes the world we live in today.
Absolutely. He observed that by breaking down complex tasks into simpler, repetitive ones. You get, a huge increase in output. And he gives 3 main reasons for this, for this boost. Workers become more skilled. When they just focus on one thing, they save time because they're not switching between different tasks all the time. And it encourages the invention of machines.
Yeah, he gives that
Yeah.
really simple but kind of charming example, right, of the boy who invents a part for the steam engine just to save himself some effort.
Just to make his life easier.
Yeah.
And it's it's this great reminder that innovation often comes from the people closest to the work, right? They're the ones solving those everyday problems.
Right. But what I think is so cool is that Smith recognized that those improvements in machinery come from a variety of sources, not just the workers themselves.
That's right. He points to the ingenuity of the machine makers,
Right.
the people who actually specialize in creating these machines. But then he goes even deeper, and he talks about philosophers, the thinkers, the speculators, the people who are observing the world, and they're the ones who can combine seemingly unrelated ideas and then create something completely new.
Yeah. He even says, philosophy itself becomes this specialized field that drives this intellectual progress.
It does.
That we all benefit from.
We all benefit from. And if you think about it, this
The cascade effect, right? So you have specialization, that leads to more expertise, and that leads to more innovation, which allows for even greater specialization. And it's all tied to this idea of exchange, this certainty that if you focus on what you're good at,
right,
you can trade your surplus for everything else you need.
Right, that you don't have to be a jack of all trades, master of none.
Exactly. And he contrasts us with, he calls it the principal part of the nothing of savages.
That's a great, So he's really highlighting how this ability to exchange goods really encourages individuals to dedicate themselves to specific occupations, to really hone their talents. And it's it's the foundation for a more complex and more productive society that can provide more goods and services to everyone.
But he also acknowledges that this division of labor is not universally applicable.
Right.
Especially in, more sparsely populated areas.
Yeah.
I mean, think of that image of, a country carpenter.
Yeah.
Who has to be so many different things.
Yeah. He uses the example of the country carpenter. Who needs to be a joiner, a cabinet maker, a carver, a wheelwright? The list goes on and on.
And he even says, it's absurd to expect a dedicated nail maker.
In the Highlands of Scotland.
Yeah, in the Highlands of Scotland. That's...
Exactly.
There's just not enough demand.
There's just not enough local demand to support that kind of specialization. And, what that illustrates is, it's really market size. That dictates the extent to which specialization can occur.
Right. So we still see that today.
Oh, absolutely.
In niche markets or
absolutely,
things like that.
Yeah.
And I also love how he talks about the role of water carriage.
Yeah.
In the early development of art and industry.
It makes sense, right? When you think about
it, it's like
opening up those wider markets.
Yeah, you got to be able to
accelerates progress.
Get your goods to people.
That's right.
And so the
exactly.
The easier and the farther you can do that, the faster things will progress.
And what's fascinating is he contrasts that with, he says, look at the rapid development that happened along coastlines and navigable rivers. Compare that to the much slower progress you see in inland regions that don't have that access to those wider markets. And he even points to the North American colonies as hugging those waterways as they expanded. So it's it really highlights how crucial infrastructure is for economic development.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lesson that's still relevant for
It is.
policymakers today
It is.
when they're thinking about investments. In things like transportation, right? So we've seen how, division of labor really boosts production. How do we determine the value
Yeah.
of all these goods being produced? Let's get into Smith's concepts of,
Yeah.
value and price, which are still debated, to this day.
Yeah. This is a big one.
Yeah.
So Smith argues that the real measure of value isn't gold or silver,
Right.
which, they can fluctuate in value themselves.
Right.
He says it's labor. Labor is the real measure of value because it represents a constant sacrifice of the laborers, ease, liberty, and happiness. That's how he puts it. And he says that sacrifice is always the same value to the laborer, regardless of what they get in return. So think of it as like the effort and the time someone puts into creating something. That's its fundamental worth.
Yeah. Well, so it's a very,
fundamental,
almost philosophical take on value.
It is.
And money then is just this convenient way to kind of express that underlying labor value.
That's right. That's right. So you have the nominal price versus the real price.
Right. The actual money versus
exactly.
the labor that went into it.
Exactly. And he talks about how societies have used different metals as money, gold, silver, copper, and he points out that they often settle on one as the primary standard. Right. And then he breaks down the exchangeable value of all commodities into three core components. You have wages, which are the earnings of labor. You have profit, which is the return on capital investment. And you have rent, which is the payment for using land or, natural resources. And he argues that these are the original sources of all revenue in a society.
And he makes this, interesting point about early agriculture where it's kind of hard to
it all gets muddled.
Disentangle those things.
It does.
The farmer who owns their land and works on it themselves is, kind of getting
earning wages for their own labor, profit, for their investment, and rent.
Yeah, all rolled into one.
For their land, exactly. And he explains that in those early stages, it's hard to tease these apart,
Right.
But as societies become more complex, as you get landowners and capitalist farmers employing laborers, those distinctions become much clearer. And rent and profit really become significant contributors to the price of the goods we buy.
Right.
And this also means that the total annual produce can purchase more labor than was used to create it.
Right.
So reflecting that growth in productivity we were talking about earlier.
Right, which leads to his observation about what he calls the idle.
Yes.
Right, those who consume without producing.
Right. And
he makes the point that
he does.
The proportion of society's output that's consumed by this group directly impacts whether a nation's wealth is increasing, decreasing, or staying the same.
Right.
Which is a pretty stark point about.
Yeah, it raises the question, for any society, what's the balance?
Right.
But between those who are contributing to the economic pie and those who are simply taking a slice, how does that affect overall prosperity? Yeah, and how does that play out? All right, let's move on to how prices actually behave in the market.
Yeah.
Smith makes this really crucial distinction between
market price
and natural price.
Yeah, this is important. So the natural price, think of that as like the cost of production. It's the rent, the labor, and the profit that it takes to bring that commodity to market at their natural or typical rates. The market price, on the other hand, that's the actual price at which the commodity is sold, and it fluctuates around this natural price.
Right.
Based on supply and demand. And he calls it effectual demand. And the distinction he makes here is it's not just that people want something, it's that they want it and they have the means to pay for it.
Right.
That's effectual demand.
Right.
And that's crucial to really understanding how markets work.
Right. And he uses corn as this example to illustrate these fluctuations, right?
He does.
Corn is so heavily influenced by weather.
The weather.
Exactly.
And he contrasts that with manufactured goods.
Yeah.
Where supply can kind of be adjusted more readily
It can.
to meet demand.
And you know, what's fascinating is he then applies this to the labor market.
Yeah.
Right. And he talks about these combinations of workmen who are trying to raise wages. And he doesn't sugarcoat it. You know, he's like, they often resort to
Right.
loud complaints and even violence.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they often justify these, you know, these demands by pointing to high food prices or
Right.
you know, the profits
Right.
that their masters are making.
Right. Yeah. And he doesn't paint
No,
a rosy picture of these early,
not at all.
you know,
Nope.
labor movements.
No, he points out that there are these counter combinations of masters who would often appeal to the authorities. You know, they would say, look, there are laws against this. You know, you need to intervene.
Right.
And he's pretty clear that these workmen seldom benefit from these violent combinations in the long run. You know, he points to, you know, this power imbalance where the magistrates often side with the masters. You know, the masters have, you know, greater financial stability. They can
Right.
withstand strikes, for instance.
Right.
And you know, the workmen, they're the ones who they need that immediate
Right.
subsistence.
Right. Yeah.
So they're often forced back to accepting whatever the prevailing wage is. And you know, in many cases, the leaders of these combinations end up being punished.
Right.
So it's not a happy story.
Yeah. Yeah. A sobering look
Yeah.
at, you know, these early
Yeah.
struggles between,
Exactly.
you know, labor and capital.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We're still dealing with today in many ways. So then Smith, he gets into this evolution of wages and living standards, particularly in Britain at the time.
Yeah.
Which is kind of fascinating to look back at.
It is. And what he does is he presents this evidence that, you know, while grain prices might have been higher in the previous century, wages were actually significantly lower. So he gives these specific examples of day wages in Scotland, you know, contrasting them with higher wages and, you know, these earlier improvements in England.
Right.
So he's trying to give this, you know, this historical perspective to how, you know, living standards have changed over time.
Yeah, and he attributes this rise in wages to an increased demand for labor driven by, you know, that progress in agriculture, manufacturing, commerce.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward supply and demand.
Yeah, it is.
But it's you know, it still holds true today.
It does.
In many sectors.
Yeah. He even mentions how, you know, sometimes like an extraordinary plenty can temporarily increase the demand and price for labor.
Right.
Because, you know, employers have more funds available to hire more workers. So you see this kind of, you know, dynamic relationship between economic growth and the lives of working people.
Right. Let's talk a little bit more about this interplay of profit and wages.
Yes.
Smith makes this really interesting point about how a low rate of profit in wealthy nations can actually be an advantage when competing with countries that have lower wages.
Yeah, and what's crucial here is his explanation that high profits actually tend to inflate prices more than high wages do, right? And he uses this example of the linen manufacturing process, and he shows how profit margins compound geometrically through the different stages of production.
Right.
Whereas wage increases, they add up arithmetically. So to give you like a simple, you know, chain to think about, it's like you have the raw material, and then there's a profit markup on that.
Right.
Okay? And that goes into manufacturing. And then the manufacturer adds a wage, and then a profit markup on the total cost. Right. Then it goes to retail. They add their wage and a profit markup on the total cost.
Right.
And so you can see how those profits on profits really add up much more significantly than just the wages added at each stage.
Right. It's not just
it's not just the wages.
The wages themselves. It's the
profits layered on top of the profits.
On the profits, yeah.
Exactly.
That's kind of a mind shift.
Yes.
For me, at least.
Yeah.
So he also looks at.
He does.
You know why wages might differ, you know, across different jobs. And this is where he introduces the idea of compensating differentials. That's right. That's right. So jobs that are disagreeable, physically demanding, dirty, often command, higher wages,
Right.
even for unskilled labor.
Right.
So he uses the example of coal miners
Right.
in Newcastle in Scotland,
Right.
who earned significantly more
Right.
than common laborers. Because, I mean, it's
a hard job. And it's risky.
it's a risky job.
Yeah.
And the inconsistency of employment
Right.
also,
Yeah.
plays a role in
Absolutely.
these wage differences.
Yeah.
He gives the example of
He does. The London coal heavers.
the London coal heavers,
Oh,
whose
exactly.
daily earnings could be very high,
They could.
but
Yeah.
they didn't have consistent work.
Right.
Right.
So you get paid a lot when you work,
Right.
but
But you might go
you may not work every day.
a while without work.
Exactly. But,
Yeah.
He also notes that, in trades without
Right.
these special privileges or,
Right.
barriers to entry,
Right.
if those high earnings
Right.
exceed what's needed to compensate for those negative aspects of the job,
Right.
competition will,
Right.
drive wages down
Right.
to a more, balanced level.
Right. So it's self-regulating
It is. It
Yeah.
is, in a way.
to a certain extent.
Yeah. He also considers the impact of risk on profits. And he uses
It is
this example of a
ongoing
smuggling,
leveling,
which can be
but high reward
highly profitable,
potentially, but obviously
less successful.
but very risky.
There's a high risk of failure,
Right.
Including, legal penalties and
Right.
loss of goods and he points out that actually, the potential for those high returns
Right.
draws so many people in
Right.
that it keeps the average profits, in those risky trades
Right.
lower than you might think. Lower than
Right.
what would truly compensate for the risk. So it's almost like human nature
Right.
at play, right, in the market. People are hoping for that big payoff,
Right.
even though
Right.
statistically the odds may not be in their favor.
Right. So he basically concludes that
Yeah.
while wages vary
Yes.
a lot based on
Right.
the agreeableness
Right.
and risk of the work,
Exactly.
profit rates
Yeah.
tend to be more consistent
Yeah. Across.
across
Different sectors of the economy.
different sectors of the economy. So
Yeah.
the the
Ambitious.
difference in pay between a common laborer and a lawyer
Yeah.
is much greater than the
That's
difference
exactly.
in profit.
Between a baker and a brewer.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So
The capital.
what that suggests is that in a relatively free market, capital tends to flow towards the most profitable ventures.
Right.
Right. And that levels out, those returns over time more
Yeah.
effectively than,
The more diverse factors that influence individual labor markets
Right.
can equalize wages.
Right. So we've looked at these natural inequalities,
Yeah.
In wages and profits. But Smith argues that European policies created much larger inequalities.
Yeah, he really goes after this.
Yeah.
And he outlines three main ways that this happened. First, by restricting competition in certain fields, right, making it harder for new people to enter.
Right.
Second, by artificially increasing competition in others, right, potentially driving, wages or profits down.
Right.
And third, by hindering the free movement of labor and capital.
Okay.
Right. So preventing resources from, flowing to their most productive uses.
All right. Let's dive into that first one.
Okay.
Restricting competition.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about,
He does.
apprenticeship laws and corporations, which have these, echoes today in our licensing and
Absolutely.
regulatory structures.
Absolutely.
He explains, how laws like the Statute of Artificers really limited entry
It did.
into certain trades.
It did. It did some weather.
And he gives these, I mean, they sound almost comical now, these distinctions they made. So, for instance, a coachmaker wasn't allowed to make his own wheels if that wasn't the established practice, in his particular guild or trade organization.
Right. Like these hyper-specific, restrictions. And he makes the point that
he does newer manufacturing centers like Manchester, Birmingham, were often exempt from
Yeah.
these kind of outdated rules.
That's right.
So they actually had a competitive advantage
They did.
because they weren't.
They weren't, bound by
Yeah.
these these old guild restrictions.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to discuss, these corporations or guilds
Right.
as and how
Right.
they're rules often restricted
Right.
competition
Right.
in order to maintain higher prices, wages, and profits for their
Yes.
members.
Right.
All at the expense
That's
of
your-
the wider public.
Right. So
Right.
not necessarily about
Let's lay here. Exactly.
quality control or
No, this was about,
Mhm.
protecting the economic interests of
Right.
this select group of established players.
right. And he's pretty critical of that. Pointing out
Yeah.
the conflict of interest between the town dwellers who benefited
That's right.
from these regulations
Yeah.
versus the disadvantages
Right.
faced by
those in the countryside.
those in the countryside
Exactly.
and consumers in general.
And if you if you kind of connect this to the bigger picture,
Right.
what he's saying is that these regulations,
Yeah.
they distort that natural balance
Right.
between town and country,
Right.
right? By artificially, inflating wages and profits in the towns.
Right.
It enables those town dwellers to purchase more of the countryside's produce with less of their own labor.
Right. So they're benefiting
Right.
at the expense of
At the expense.
the landlords, the farmers,
It's
the
a loss,
landlords, the farmers, and ultimately it affects everyone
everywhere.
because it
Right.
it affects the
Right. It impacts the availability of food and
exactly
resources. And then he makes this surprising argument
yeah
about, the
Yeah.
supposed superiority
of country labor.
of country labor. He suggests that.
Yeah.
The common plowman
Yeah.
dealing with
Variety of tasks.
a variety of tasks,
Yeah.
adapting to
Different conditions.
different conditions. Having to exercise
Yeah.
judgment,
Much more
discretion.
judgment and discretion that they actually, possess. More judgment and discretion
Yeah,
than a town mechanic focused on,
repetitive operations.
very simple, repetitive operations.
Yeah,
Which is an interesting take.
it is, and he even points to places like China and Indostan
Yeah.
as examples where country laborers were held,
Right.
in higher regard than
Right.
town artisans, and he attributes,
Yeah.
the suppression of
Right.
country laborers, wages and status in Europe to,
Right.
these very corporation laws that we were talking about,
Right.
which, artificially elevated the status and pay of certain, urban crafts. Right.